to this point in the conference, we've been thinking about arguments for the existence of God, but of course there's a case on the other side to be offered as well. And so now we want to turn our attention to arguments for atheism. And certainly the problem of evil and suffering is the greatest obstacle to belief in the existence of God. When I ponder the depth and the extent of human suffering in the world, whether due to man's own inhumanity to man or due to natural disasters, then I have to confess that I find it hard to believe in God. And doubtless many of you have felt the same way. Maybe we should just all become atheists. But that would be a pretty big step to take, wouldn't it? How can we be sure that God does not exist? Maybe there's a reason why God permits all the evil and suffering in the world. Maybe it somehow all fits in to a grand scheme of things which we can only dimly discern, if at all. How do we know? Well, as a Christian theist, I'm persuaded that the problem of evil, as terrible as it is, does not in the end constitute a disproof of the existence of the Christian God. On the contrary, I think that Christian theism is man's last best hope for a solution to the problem of evil. Now, in order to explain why I feel this way, it will be helpful to draw some distinctions to help keep our thinking clear. First and foremost, we need to distinguish between the intellectual problem of evil and the emotional problem of evil. And here we should have a PowerPoint slide to illustrate that point. The intellectual problem of evil concerns how to give a rational explanation of how God and evil can coexist. The emotional problem of evil concerns how to dissolve people's emotional dislike of a God who would permit suffering. Now let's look first at the intellectual problem of evil together. There are two versions of this problem. First, the logical version of the problem of evil, and then secondly, the probabilistic version of the problem of evil. According to the logical version of the problem of evil, it is logically impossible for God and evil to coexist. They're like the immovable object and the irresistible force. They cannot coexist. If God exists, then evil cannot exist. If evil exists, then God cannot exist. Now, since evil obviously exists, it therefore follows that God does not exist. Now, the problem with this version of the argument is that there's just no good reason to think that God and evil are logically incompatible. After all, there's no explicit contradiction between the propositions God exists and evil exists. But if the atheist means that there's some implicit contradiction between these two propositions, then he must be assuming some hidden premises which would bring out this contradiction and make it explicit. But the problem is that no philosopher has ever been able to successfully identify what those hidden assumptions are. For example, it's been suggested that those hidden assumptions might be necessarily, if God is all-powerful, he can create any world that he wants. And necessarily, if God is all good, then he would prefer a world without evil and suffering. Since God is all good and all powerful, it follows that he both could create a world without evil and that he would prefer a world without evil, which would imply that evil does not exist, and that contradicts the fact that evil exists. So those hidden premises would expose a logical inconsistency between the statements that an all-powerful, all-good God exists and evil exists. The problem is that neither of those hidden assumptions appears to be necessarily true. Just think about them. If God has created creatures endowed with freedom of the will, then he cannot guarantee how they will choose. it is logically impossible to make someone freely do something. That is as logically impossible as a married bachelor or a square triangle. And therefore, if it's possible that creatures are free, there's no guarantee that in a world that God has created with free creatures that they would always do the right thing. That is to say, just because God is all-powerful doesn't mean that he can create a world in which creatures would always freely do the right thing and evil would not exist. So that first assumption is just not necessarily true. Similarly, what about the assumption that necessarily if God is all good, he would prefer a world without suffering? Well, again, that just isn't necessarily the case. We all know examples in which we permit some instance of suffering to occur because of a greater good which would justify our permitting that suffering. C.S. Lewis once remarked in this connection, what do people mean when they say, I'm not afraid of God because I know that he's good? Have they never even been to the dentist? And remember, Lewis wrote that before they used Novocaine when they drilled on your teeth. So clearly, it's not true that necessarily, if God is all good, he would prefer a world without suffering. He might have overriding goods that would justify the permission of suffering. So, no philosopher has ever been able to successfully identify what would be those necessarily true assumptions that would bring out the contradiction between God and evil. And therefore, the logical problem of evil has failed to prove any inconsistency between God and evil. In fact, more than that, we can actually prove, I think, that God and evil are logically consistent. You see, the atheist presupposes that God cannot have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil in the world. But that assumption is just not necessarily true. As long as it's even possible that God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing the evil in the world, then it follows that God and evil are logically consistent. And that certainly seems to be at least possible, doesn't it? And therefore, I'm very pleased to be able to report this morning that it is widely agreed among philosophers today, both atheist and theist alike, that the logical version of the problem of evil has been dissolved. The coexistence of God and evil is at least logically possible. But we're not out of the woods yet. For now we confront the probabilistic problem of evil. According to this version of the problem, the coexistence of God and evil is logically possible, but nevertheless, it's highly improbable. The extent and the depth of evil and suffering in the world is such that it's improbable that God could have morally sufficient reasons for permitting it. And therefore, given the evil in the world, it is at least improbable that God exists. Now, this is a much more powerful argument because the conclusion is so much more modest. And therefore, I want to spend the bulk of our time together this morning looking at this version of the problem of evil. And in response to this version of the problem, I want to make three main points. First, we're not in a good position to say that it's improbable that God lacks morally sufficient reasons for permitting the suffering in the world. We're not in a good position to say with any kind of confidence that it's improbable that God lacks morally sufficient reasons for permitting the suffering in the world. You see, as finite persons, we are limited in time and space, in intelligence and insight, but the transcendent and sovereign God sees the end of history from the beginning and providentially orders history so that his purposes are ultimately achieved through the free decisions of human beings. In order to achieve his purposes, God may well have to allow a great deal of suffering along the way. Suffering which appears pointless to us within our limited frame of reference may be seen to have been justly permitted within God's wider frame of reference. Let me give two illustrations of this point, one from contemporary science and one from popular culture. First illustration. In so-called chaos theory, scientists have discovered that certain large-scale systems, such as the weather or insect populations, are highly sensitive to the tiniest disturbances. So that, for example, a butterfly fluttering its wings on a twig in the jungles of West Africa can set in motion forces that will eventually cause a hurricane over the Atlantic Ocean. And yet no one observing that little butterfly fluttering on the branch could even in principle predict such an outcome. We simply have no way of knowing how some alteration of a seemingly insignificant event can eventually radically alter the world. Second illustration. The movie Sliding Doors, starring Gwyneth Paltrow, tells the story of a young woman who is rushing down the stairs to the subway to catch a train. And as she nears the train, the movie splits into two different paths that her life might take. In the one life, the doors to the subway train slide shut just before she's able to board. In the other life, however, she makes it through the doors just before they close. And based upon this seemingly trivial, insignificant event, the two trajectories of her life take increasingly divergent paths as time goes on. In the one life, she becomes enormously successful, prosperous, happy. In the other life, she encounters misery, failure, defeat, and unhappiness. And all because of that split-second difference in getting through or being blocked by those sliding doors. Moreover, that difference is due to the fact of whether or not a little girl playing with her dolly on the stairway to the subway is snatched away by her father just in time to allow the woman to get down the stairs and board the train. And as you watch the film, you can't help but wonder about what other seeming trivialities led up to that event. For example, whether the father and the daughter were delayed that morning because the little girl didn't like the breakfast cereal that her mother gave her that morning for breakfast, or whether the father was perhaps inattentive to his daughter that morning because his mind was distracted and preoccupied by something he had read in the morning newspaper, and so on and so forth. But the most interesting part of this movie is the film's ending. In the happy, successful life, the young woman is suddenly and unexpectedly killed in an accident. And that part of the film comes to an end. While in the other life, her life turns around, and it turns out that the life of hardship and failure and suffering are really the truly good life after all. Now, my point is obviously not that things always turn out for the best in this earthly life. Not at all. My point is much more modest. It is simply that given the dizzying complexity of life, we are in no position at all to judge that God probably has no good reason for allowing a specific instance of suffering to afflict our lives. You see, every event that occurs in history sends a ripple effect through history so that God's morally sufficient reasons for permitting it might not emerge until centuries from now, maybe even in another country. Only an all-knowing God could grasp the infinite complexities of directing a world of free people toward his previsioned goals. Just think of the innumerable, incalculable events that would have to be calculated in order to arrive at a single event in human history, say the Allied victory at D-Day. We have no idea of what suffering might be involved in order for God to achieve his intended purpose through the freely chosen actions of human persons, nor should we expect to see God's reasons for permitting suffering. And therefore, it's hardly surprising that much of the suffering in the world appears pointless and unnecessary to us, because we're simply not in a position to make these kinds of judgments. We are overwhelmed by this sort of complexity. Now notice, this is not to appeal to mystery, to say God works in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform. No, this is rather to point to our inherent cognitive limitations, which make it impossible for us to say, when confronted with some instance of suffering, that God probably has no good reason for permitting this event to occur. And unbelievers themselves recognize this point in other contexts. For example, one of the decisive objections to utilitarianism, which is an ethical theory that says that you should always do whatever will bring about the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people. One of the decisive objections to utilitarianism is that we have no idea of the ultimate outcome of our actions. Some action that brings about a short-term good might lead to disaster in the long run. And something that looks horrible in the short term might turn out to be the greatest good for humanity. We just don't have a clue. We're not in a position to make those kinds of probability judgments. Now, some atheist philosophers have recently objected to this point by saying that if you say that the evil in the world fails to disprove the existence of a good God, then you've also got to say that the good in the world fails to disprove the existence of an evil God, which is absurd. My response to this objection is to agree that the two cases are precisely on a par. You can't disprove the existence of an evil God by pointing to all the goods in the world, since an evil God could permit the goods in the world for his own nefarious purposes, just as a good God can have reasons for permitting the evils in the world, so an evil God could have reasons for permitting the goods in the world. So neither of these arguments is any good. Keep in mind that the theist doesn't believe in God's goodness as a result of an inductive survey of the world's events, looking around at the world's events and saying, well, most of them are good, therefore God must be good. Rather, the theist believes in God's goodness on other grounds. Maybe he believes in God's goodness on the basis of the Bible. Or maybe he has an ontological argument for the existence of God as the greatest conceivable being and hence a morally perfect being. Maybe he has a moral argument for God's existence as the paradigm of objective moral values. Whatever reason the theist might have for accepting the goodness of God, the point remains that we are simply not in a position to say with any kind of confidence that God lacks morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evils that we observe in life. Once you contemplate God's providence over the whole of human history, then I think you can see how hopeless it is for finite, limited observers to speculate about the probability of God's having a morally sufficient reason for this or that evil that we observe. We're simply not in a position to assess these kinds of probabilities with any confidence. Secondly, and here I want to jump to point C on our PowerPoint outline and on your handout, point C, relative to the full scope of the evidence, God's existence is probable. Relative to the full scope of the evidence, God's existence is probable. The key point to understand here is that probabilities are always relative to background information. For example, suppose we're given the information that Joe is an OSU student and that 90% of OSU students enjoy eating at Lone Star Steakhouse. Now, relative to that information, that makes it highly probable that Joe enjoys eating at Lone Star Steakhouse. But now, suppose we're given the additional information that Joe is a vegetarian, and that 90% of the vegetarian students at OSU do not enjoy eating at Lone Star Steakhouse. Suddenly, the probabilities that Joe enjoys eating at that steakhouse are greatly diminished, indeed reversed. Relative to this new information, it is highly improbable that Joe enjoys eating at the Lone Star Steakhouse. So, to repeat the point, probabilities are relative to background information. So, when the atheist says to you that God's existence is improbable, you should immediately ask yourself, improbable relative to what? Relative to the evil and suffering in the world? Well, if that's all you consider for your background information, then it's hardly surprising that God's existence would look improbable relative to that alone. Though, as I've just argued in the first point, appearances can be deceiving. But that's not the really interesting question, is it? The really interesting question is God's existence probable relative to the full scope of the evidence? And I'm persuaded that when you consider the full scope of the evidence, then God's existence is quite probable, even given any improbability that evil might be thought to throw upon God's existence. Let me mention 3 pieces of evidence in this regard. Number 1 is the origin of the universe. The origin of the universe. Typically, atheists have said that the universe is just eternal and uncaused. But there are good reasons, both philosophically and scientifically, to doubt that the universe is beginningless. Philosophically, the idea of an infinite past is absurd. Just think about it for a minute. If the universe never began to exist, that means that the number of events in the past history of the universe is infinite. But mathematicians recognize that the existence of an actually infinite number of real things leads to self-contradictions. For example, what is infinity minus infinity? Well, mathematically, you get self-contradictory answers. This shows that infinity is just an idea in your mind, a mathematical concept, not something that exists in reality. But that entails that since past events aren't just ideas in your mind, but are real, the number of past events must therefore be finite. Therefore, the series of past events can't go back and back and back forever. Rather, the universe must have begun to exist. This purely philosophical conclusion has been confirmed by remarkable discoveries in astronomy and astrophysics. We now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning a finite time ago. In the year 2003, Arvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to prove that any universe, which is on average in a state of expansion throughout its history, cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a past space-time boundary. And what makes their proof so powerful is that it holds regardless of the physical description of the early universe. Because we can't yet provide a physical description of the first split second of the universe, This brief moment has been fertile ground for speculations. But the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem is independent of any physical description of that moment. Their theorem implies that the quantum vacuum state out of which our universe may have evolved, which some scientific popularizers have misleadingly characterized as nothing, that state cannot be eternal in the past, but must have had an absolute beginning. In fact, even if our universe is just a tiny part of a much greater multiverse composed of many universes, the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem requires that the multiverse itself must have a beginning. Speculative theories such as pre-Big Bang inflationary scenarios, loop quantum gravity scenarios, and so forth, have been crafted to try to avoid this absolute beginning, but none of these theories has succeeded in restoring an eternal past. At the very most, they just push the beginning back a step. In fact, in this year, Alexander Vilenkin and his graduate student Audrey Mathani published a paper entitled "Does the Universe or Did the Universe Have a Beginning?" And Vilenkin, in his talk at Cambridge University on the 70th birthday party celebration for Stephen Hawking, concluded his survey by saying this, and I quote, "There are no models at this time that provide a satisfactory model for a universe without a beginning." Now that's a remarkable statement. He's not saying there are some conjectural models, but we don't know if they're accurate, that would avoid the beginning. What he says, there are no models at this time that provide a satisfactory model for a universe without a beginning. And therefore, in an interview conducted on that occasion, Vilenkin says, and I quote, "All the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning," end quote. So in his book, Many Worlds in One, Vilenkin concludes in this way: "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. And that problem is posed by the inevitable question, why did the universe come into being? What brought the universe into existence? Well, unless you're willing to say that the universe just popped into being, uncaused, out of absolutely nothing, there must be a transcendent cause beyond space and time which created the universe. Now, recently, some physicists like Lawrence Krauss have mischaracterized the early quantum vacuum state out of which the universe may have come as being nothing, and that therefore they've claimed modern science can explain the origin of the universe out of nothing. This is simply a misrepresentation of those theories, and indeed a gross distortion of science. The quantum vacuum state is not nothing, and it is not eternal in the past. This point was made very forcefully by David Albert, a very prominent philosopher of quantum physics, in his review of Krauss's book on March 23rd, 2012. And I want to read you from Albert's review because it's so extraordinary what he has to say. He says, according to relativistic quantum field theories, particles are understood as specific arrangements of the fields. Certain arrangements of the fields, for example, correspond to there being 14 particles in the universe. Certain other arrangements correspond to there being no particles at all. And those last arrangements are referred to in the jargon of quantum field theories, for obvious reasons, as vacuum states. He goes on to say, Krauss seems to think that these vacuum states amount to the relativistic quantum field theoretical version of there being no physical stuff at all. But he says that's just not right. Relativistic quantum field theoretical vacuum states are particular arrangements of elementary physical stuff. The fact that some arrangements of these fields happen to correspond to the existence of particles and some don't is not a whit more mysterious than the fact that some of the possible arrangements of my fingers happen to correspond to the existence of a fist, and some don't. And the fact that particles can pop in and out of existence over time as those fields rearrange themselves is not a whit more mysterious than the fact that fists can pop in and out of existence over time as my fingers rearrange themselves. And none of these poppings, he says, amounts to anything even remotely in the neighborhood of a creation from nothing. He concludes, Krauss is dead wrong, and his religious and philosophical critics are absolutely right. So we can formulate this reasoning in the form of a simple argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Or alternatively, the universe began to exist. Two, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a transcendent cause from which it follows, therefore the universe has a transcendent cause. So the cause of the universe must be a being which exists beyond space and time. Now, what could that possibly be? Well, there are only two candidates that I know of that could fit that description. Either an abstract object, like a number or some other mathematical entity, or else an unembodied mind or consciousness. But you see, abstract objects don't stand in causal relations. That's part of what it means to be abstract. The number 7, for example, can't cause anything. It doesn't have any effects on anything. And therefore, it follows logically that the most plausible explanation of the universe is an unembodied mind or a personal creator of the universe. So this argument, I think, gives us very powerful reasons for believing in a transcendent, immaterial, beginningless, uncaused, personal, and enormously powerful creator of the universe. Second consideration is the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. In recent decades, scientists have been stunned by the discovery that the initial conditions of the universe were fine-tuned for the existence of intelligent, interactive life with a precision and delicacy that literally defy human comprehension. And this fine-tuning is of two sorts. First, when the laws of nature are expressed as mathematical equations, you find appearing in them certain constants, like the gravitational constant. Now, these constants are not determined by the laws of nature. Second, in addition to these constants, there are certain initial conditions or arbitrary quantities which are simply put in on which the laws of nature then operate. For example, the amount of entropy in the early universe. Now, all of these constants and quantities fall into an extraordinarily narrow range of life-permitting values. Were these constants or quantities to be altered by less than a hair's breadth, the balance would be destroyed and life would not exist. We now know that life-prohibiting universes are incomprehensibly more probable than any life-permitting universe. Now, there are three possible explanations of this extraordinary fine-tuning of the universe: either physical necessity, chance, or design. Now, it can't be due to physical necessity because, as I said, the constants and the quantities are independent of the laws of nature. The laws of nature are consistent with a wide range of values of these constants and quantities. So, maybe the fine-tuning of the universe is due to chance. After all, highly improbable events happen every day. But what serves to distinguish purely chance events from design is not simply enormously high improbability, but also the presence of an independently given pattern to which the event conforms. For example, in the movie Contact, scientists are able to distinguish a signal from outer space from just random noise, not merely by its improbability, but by its conforming to the pattern of the prime numbers. And the fine tuning of the universe for intelligent life exhibits just that combination of incomprehensible improbability plus an independently given pattern that are the earmarks of design. Now, some theorists have sought to avoid the design hypothesis and support the chance hypothesis by appealing to what's called the many worlds hypothesis. According to that hypothesis, our universe is just one part of a vast world ensemble of universes, or a multiverse, which are randomly ordered in their constants and quantities, and preferably infinite in number. If all of these other universes really exist, then by chance alone, life-permitting universes would appear somewhere in the ensemble. And since only finely tuned universes have observers in them, any observers that exist in the world ensemble will naturally observe their world to be finely tuned for their existence. So no appeal to design is necessary in order to explain the observed fine tuning. It's just by chance alone. And I am not exaggerating when I say that this is where the debate over fine tuning lies today. It is between these competing metaphysical hypotheses of the world ensemble hypothesis versus an intelligent designer. And it seems to me that the world ensemble hypothesis suffers from a fatal objection. The fallacy of the world ensemble reasoning is its assumption that only finely tuned universes have observers in them. And that is in fact not true. As Roger Penrose has pointed out, the odds of our universe's initial low entropy condition existing by chance alone is on the order of 1 chance out of 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. By contrast, he says, the odds of our solar system suddenly forming by just the random collision of particles, just suddenly coming together, is about 1 chance out of 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 60. Now that may sound like a large number, but Penrose says it is utter chicken feed in comparison with 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. And what that means is that it is far, far more likely that an island of order no larger than our solar system should be observed by us, since such a world of that size is unfathomably, incomprehensibly more probable than a finely tuned universe like ours. In fact, there are even smaller observable worlds which are yet more probable. Carried to its extreme, this has led to what some theorists have called the invasion of the Boltzmann brains. For the most probable observable universe is one which consists of a single brain which fluctuates into existence by a random fluctuation in the quantum vacuum and observes its universe. Such a universe is not fine-tuned for the existence of intelligent, interactive, embodied life, and yet it is an observable universe, a single Boltzmann brain. And so it's simply not true that finely tuned universes are the only observable universes. Quite the contrary. The most probable, by far observable universes will be Boltzmann brain universes. Partisans of the many worlds hypothesis would have to prove that these Boltzmann brain worlds do not represent a significant portion of the observable universes in the world ensemble, which is simply contrary to the standard measure of probability. So with the failure of the many worlds hypothesis, it seems to me that the last defense, the last ring of defense for the chance hypothesis falls away. And therefore, it follows that the fine-tuning of the universe is best explained by the existence of a cosmic designer. And as I've said, we can formulate this into a very simple, easily memorizable argument. One, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Two, it is not due to physical necessity or chance, from which it follows logically. Three, therefore, it is due to design. And thus, the fine-tuning of the universe implies the existence of a designer of the cosmos. Number three is objective moral values and duties in the world. Objective moral values and duties in the world. By objective moral values, I mean moral values which are valid and binding independently of whether people believe in them or not. And many theists and atheists alike agree that if God does not exist, then moral values and duties are not objective in that sense. For example, Steven Pinker of Harvard University wrote in 2008, and I quote, "The scientific outlook has taught us that some parts of our subjective experience are products of our biological makeup, and so have no objective counterpart in the world. The tastiness of fruit, the scariness of heights, the prettiness of flowers are features of our common nervous system. And if our species had evolved in a different ecosystem, our reactions could go the other way. Now," he says, "if the distinction between right and wrong is also a product of brain wiring, why should we believe it is any more real? And if it is just a collective hallucination, how could we argue that evils like genocide and slavery are wrong for everyone rather than just distasteful for me?" Pinker has no answer to this question, and so he opts for a non-objective account of morality, which basically amounts to the injunction, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, and so we'll get along well together in society. Michael Ruse, who is an agnostic philosopher of science, I think draws the conclusion. Ruse says morality is a biological adaptation no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory." End quote. So on a naturalistic worldview, moral values and duties are just the byproducts of evolutionary conditioning and social conditioning. Just as a troop of baboons will exhibit cooperative and even self-sacrificial behavior because natural selection has determined it to be advantageous in the struggle for survival, so their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, exhibit similar behavior for exactly the same reason. As a result of socio-biological pressures, there has evolved among Homo sapiens a sort of herd morality, which functions well in the perpetuation of our species. But on the atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything that makes this morality objectively binding and true. But the problem is that objective moral values and duties plausibly do exist. In moral experience, we apprehend a realm of objective moral values and duties which impose themselves upon us. There's no more reason to deny the objective reality of the moral realm than the objective reality of the physical world. Actions like rape, cruelty, child abuse aren't just socially unacceptable behavior. They're moral abominations. Michael Ruse himself admits, and I quote, "The man who says it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. Notice here that Ruse equates the necessity of certain moral truths with mathematical truths, necessary truths. Some things, at least, are really wrong. Thus, I think evil, paradoxically, actually serves to establish the existence of God. For if objective moral values cannot exist without God, and objective moral values do exist, as is evident from the reality of evil, then it follows inescapably that God exists. Thus, although on a superficial level, evil seems to call into question God's existence, on a more fundamental level, it actually demonstrates God's existence, because in the absence of God, good and evil, as such, would not exist. So we could formulate a moral argument along these lines. Number one, if God did not exist, objective moral values and duties would not exist. Two, evil exists. That's the premise furnished by the atheist. Three, therefore, objective moral values and duties exist. Some things are really evil. Four, therefore, God exists. Now, this is only part of the evidence that God exists. The prominent philosopher Alvin Plantinga has defended 24 or so arguments for God's existence. And I believe that the cumulative force of these arguments makes it very probable that God exists, even given any improbability that evil might be thought to throw upon God's existence. Finally, I want to return now to the second point that I skipped, which is the fact that the Christian faith entails doctrines that increase the probability of the coexistence of God and evil. The Christian faith entails doctrines that increase the probability of the coexistence of God and evil. In so doing, these doctrines decrease any improbability that evil might be thought to throw upon the existence of God. Given the existence of the Christian God, it's not really all that surprising that we would find a world suffused with natural and moral evil. Well, what are some of these doctrines? Let me mention 4 of them. First, the chief purpose of life is not happiness, but the knowledge of God. One of the reasons that the problem of evil seems so intractable, I think, is that we naturally tend to believe that if God exists, then his goal for human life is happiness in this world. God's role is to provide a comfortable environment for his human pets. But on the Christian view, this is false. We are not God's pets. And man's end is not happiness in this life, but rather the knowledge of God, which in the end will bring true and everlasting human fulfillment. Many evils occur in life which may be utterly pointless with respect to the goal of producing human happiness, but they may not be pointless with respect to producing a deeper knowledge of God. Innocent human suffering provides an occasion for deeper dependency and trust in God, either on the part of the sufferer himself or on the part of those around him. Now, whether God's purpose is achieved through what we suffer all depends on our response. Do we respond with anger and bitterness and hatred toward God, or do we turn to him in faith for strength and power to endure? Second, mankind is in a state of rebellion against God and his purpose. Rather than submit to and worship God, people rebel against God and go their own way, and so find themselves alienated from God, morally guilty before him, and groping in spiritual darkness, pursuing false gods of their own making. The terrible human evils in this world are simply testimony to man's depravity in this state of moral and spiritual alienation from God. And so the Christian isn't surprised at the terrible human evil in the world. On the contrary, He expects it. The Bible says that God has given mankind over to the sin it has chosen. He does not interfere to stop it. He lets human depravity run its course. This only serves to heighten mankind's moral responsibility before God, as well as our wickedness and our need of His forgiveness and moral cleansing. Third, the knowledge of God spills over into eternal life. In the Christian view, this life is not all there is. Jesus promised eternal life to all who would place their trust in Him as Savior and Lord. In the afterlife, God will reward those who have borne their suffering in courage and trust with an eternal life of unspeakable joy. The Apostle Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament, lived a life of incredible suffering. When you think about it, he suffered both from natural and moral evils. And yet he wrote the following words: "We do not lose heart, for this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, because we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal." 2 Corinthians 4:16-18. Here Paul imagines, as it were, a scale on which the sufferings of this life are placed on one side, and on the other side is placed the glory that God will bestow upon His children in heaven. And Paul says the weight of glory is so great that the sufferings of this life are not even worth comparing to it, literally beyond comprehension with what God will give us. Moreover, think about this: the longer we spend in eternity, the more the sufferings of this life shrink by comparison to literally an infinitesimal moment. And that's why Paul could refer to them as a slight, momentary affliction. They were simply overwhelmed by the ocean of divine eternity and joy which God lavishes upon those who trust Him. Finally, number 4, the knowledge of God is an incommensurable good. To know God, the source of infinite value and infinite love, is an incomparable good. It is the fulfillment of human existence. It is what we were made for. The sufferings of this life cannot even be compared to it. And thus, the person who knows God, no matter what he suffers, no matter how awful his pain, can still truly say, God is good to me, just in virtue of the fact that he knows God, an incommensurable good. These 4 Christian doctrines, then, if true, greatly reduce any improbability which evil would seem to cast upon the existence of God. In other words, evil is not really very much of a problem for Christian theism. Evil is much more probable given Christian theism than some bare-bone generic monotheism. The atheist would have to refute all of these Christian doctrines in order to show that evil is improbable on Christian theism, and that's a quite different and independent project. So, in summary then, if my 3 theses are correct, then evil does not render improbable the existence of the Christian God. On the contrary, I believe that when you consider the full scope of the evidence, then God's existence is quite probable. And therefore, I think the intellectual problem of evil has failed to overthrow God's existence. But that then takes us on to the emotional problem of evil. And in fact, I personally think that most people who reject God because of the evil and suffering in the world, don't really do so for intellectual reasons. They have never thought about this problem in any depth. They just don't like a God who would permit them or others to suffer terribly, and so they want nothing to do with him. Theirs is not an atheism of refutation, it's simply an atheism of rejection. Does the Christian faith have anything to say to these people? Well, it certainly does. For the Christian faith tells us that God is not a distant creator or some unmoved ground of being. Rather, he is a loving heavenly Father who shares our sufferings and who hurts along with us. Alvin Plantinga has written the following: as the Christian sees things, God does not stand idly by, coolly observing the suffering of his creatures. He enters into and shares our suffering. He endures the anguish of seeing his Son, the second person of the Trinity, consigned to the bitterly cruel and shameful death of the cross. Christ was prepared to endure the agonies of hell itself in order to overcome sin and death and the evils that afflict our world, and to confer on us a life more glorious than we can imagine. He was prepared to suffer on our behalf, to accept suffering of which we can form no comprehension. End quote. You see, Jesus on the cross endured a suffering which is literally beyond human comprehension. For he bore the punishment for the sin of the whole world. None of us can comprehend that suffering, even though he was innocent. If anyone could complain of innocent suffering, it was Jesus of Nazareth. And yet, even though he was innocent, he voluntarily took upon himself the punishment that we deserved. And why? Because he loves you so much. How can we reject him who was willing to give up everything for our sake? When we comprehend his sacrifice and his love for us, then I think this puts the problem of evil in an entirely different perspective. For now we see that the true problem of evil is really the problem of our evil, filled with sin and morally guilty before God. The question we face is not how God can justify himself to us. The question is how we can be justified before him. So paradoxically, even though the problem of evil is the greatest obstacle to the belief in the existence of God, at the end of the day, I believe that God is the only answer to the problem of evil. If God does not exist, then we are locked without hope in a world filled with gratuitous and unredeemed suffering. God is the final answer to the problem of evil, for he redeems us from evil and takes us into the everlasting joy of an incommensurable good, fellowship with himself. Thank you, and I'll take your questions. Yes.
If God is perfect, why does he need us to worship him, and why does he need human
If God
beings?
is perfect, what?
Why does he need to create human beings? Why does he need
Yes.
to create a universe?
If God is perfect, why does he need to create human beings? He doesn't need to create human beings. Creation is a freely willed act of God. Since God is perfect, he is completely fulfilled within the Trinity of his own being, in that eternal, timeless love relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. There is complete fulfillment, complete happiness. God is supremely happy, completely good, and perfect. What that means is that creation cannot be for God's benefit. It can only be for the benefit of the creature. It is to give finite created persons the opportunity to come into fellowship with an incommensurable good. That is to say, the knowledge of God himself. And so, not only is salvation by grace, creation is by grace. Creation is the unmerited favor of God bestowed upon creatures so that they can come to have this wonderful, incommensurable good of fellowship with God as his adopted children. And of course, the tragedy then of life is that so many freely reject this wonderful offer of God's grace and separate themselves from him. Yes?
In Paul Copan's workshop, he mentioned some objections to the second premise of the moral argument, which included a quote from Michael Roos that you also gave.
Yes.
About morality just being illusory. It's just adopted through biological, social conditioning. And he mentioned how Roos claims that our beliefs are just merely illusory along with respect to moral intuition and stuff. And he mentioned how that's a self-refuting proposition with the fact that our beliefs are only illusory. That belief itself would be illusory. And Alvin Plantinga wrote an argument about the evolutionary argument against naturalism that Paul Copan also went on to. I just want to know if you wanted to say a few things about that.
Well, I didn't, because I wasn't trying to refute but the question was about Roos's position that moral and ethical values that are instilled into us by sociobiological conditioning are illusions. And Alvin Plantinga has developed an argument against naturalism where he says that all of our cognitive faculties on naturalism are aimed simply at survival value, not at truth value. And so you couldn't have confidence in any of your beliefs on naturalism, including the belief that naturalism is true. And therefore, naturalism is inherently unaffirmable. It cannot be rationally affirmed because it has within itself a defeater of itself. I find the argument very persuasive. I've never actually used it because it is Plantinga's and he's developed it, but I've never heard a good response to it. It seems to me that it is a very powerful argument, not against the truth of naturalism, but against the rationality of naturalism. Naturalism cannot be rationally affirmed to be true. Yes?
What is the incentive for atheists to try to defeat Christianity or theism?
To try to what, Christianity?
To defeat Christianity or theism. I don't believe in Buddhism, the Tooth Fairy, or Hinduism. I give it zero time to try to defeat those principles. Do they just protest too much?
Why are atheists so intent on defeating Christianity or other forms of religion? Indeed, the new atheism is committed, as I think I said this morning, to even eradicating religion within the private lives of citizens. Why? Well, I think, speaking from their point of view, it's because they believe that religion is inherently connected with violence, intolerance, and persecution. They look at the specter of Islamic terrorism, and they paint all religious belief with the same brush. And so we get lumped in with these Islamic terrorists who are willing to use violence and persecution in the propagation of religion. They don't seem to understand that Jesus of Nazareth taught a quite different ethic, namely, you should love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you and do good to them that despitefully use you. So I think it is because of their belief that, as I think it was Christopher Hitchens said, religion poisons everything, and therefore it's bad for society, and that's why they want to get rid of it. Yes?
My question is related to the first one. If all human beings are created to enjoy fellowship with God, why God, in his omniscience, created those beings who that he knew would reject him and thereby be condemned to eternal separation from him?
This is the problem of religious pluralism and religious diversity. And what I suggest there is two things. Number one, it may not be feasible for God to create a world in which everyone freely embraces salvation and comes to him. It's logically impossible to make people do something freely. So it may sadly be the case that in any world of free creatures, there will always be some who will freely reject God in his every effort to save them. But I take seriously the scriptures that say God wants all persons to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth, that God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. So his plan and his will is universal salvation, and he works toward that end. And the fact that universal salvation is not achieved is only because people freely repudiate God in his every effort to save them. And it may be that there is no world of universal salvation, of free creatures that's available to God. The other thing is that it may be that if there are worlds of universal salvation, that they have overriding deficiencies that make them less preferable. And one that I thought of, for example, would be maybe they've only got 2 or 3 people in them. And if he were to create any more, then at least one of them would reject God. And that would seem to be a pretty deficient world. It seems to me that so long as God gives sufficient grace for salvation to every person he creates, that those who would freely repudiate God and his grace shouldn't be allowed to have some kind of veto power over which worlds God is free to create. Why should the blessedness and the eternal happiness of those who would freely respond to God and his grace be prevented by those obdurate people who would freely reject God and his every effort to save them? It seems to me that God is no less loving for preferring a world in which some people are lost despite God's every effort to save them. They have no one to blame but themselves.
What about the argument that it seems like God is actually maybe commands evil in the Old Testament, like in telling the Israelites to go in and kill this culture or this people group and to clean out the promised land and things like that?
I don't think that that's relevant to the argument that I've given today. How would you see it where would it be relevant?
I guess just that the problem of evil, that God is actually, we say that God is all loving or completely good, but in the Old Testament maybe, and this is not, like you said, I'm not actually espousing this argument, just I've had it posed to me a number of times that he actually commands what we would consider evil to happen to.
I just can't see, if you really think hard about this, I just can't see that that's relevant to any premise of any argument that I gave in this talk. What that is, let's imagine a worst case scenario, okay, that God couldn't have issued such commands because they would be inconsistent with an all perfect and all good being. What that really is just an attack on the historical credibility of the Old Testament is all. That's all that really is. It's an argument to say these ancient Hebrew narratives can't be right. They're either legends about the founding of the nation of Israel that never really happened, or else if these events did happen, the Israeli armies in a fit of nationalism thought God is on our side and began to do things that they thought God had commanded them to do that he really hadn't. So even if at the very worst, this is really nothing more than just an argument against biblical inerrancy, and as such really isn't germane to the question of the existence of God, resurrection of Jesus, or any of those things. And I think unbelievers who press this argument simply are using an emotional ploy here that is really strictly irrelevant. This would be an argument that would need to be discussed when we do doctrine of inspiration and doctrine of biblical inerrancy. Do these narratives force us to say that these narratives are inaccurate because of the inaccurate portrayal they give of a perfectly good and omnibenevolent being? Now, if you're interested in my take on this, I've discussed this in my questions of the week on our Reasonable Faith website, question number 16, and then I revisit that, I think, around question 245 or something like that, where I say the slaughter of the Canaanites revisited. And that will give you my take on how I would go about defending the historicity of these Old Testament narratives. But I don't want to say anything more about that here because it's really not relevant to the argument about God's existence or the problem of evil.
So at best, they're just saying, fine, God may exist, but I don't like the way he operates.
No, at worst what it is, it's an argument against the reliability of the Old Testament. It's an argument against the historical credibility of these ancient Hebrew narratives of the conquest of Canaan. That's all this is. And you could admit that and be a Christian. I mean, not all Christians believe in biblical inerrancy. Somebody could say, yeah, I give that up, but I still believe God exists. I believe he's a Trinity. I believe Jesus rose from the dead. None of those things is affected by the historicity of the narratives of the conquest of Canaan.
Okay.
Now, I don't take that position, but take a look at my question of the week for my take on this question. Yes?
For the atheist to say that it's improbable God has morally sufficient reasons.
You're going to have to not mumble. Speak up.
Sorry. For the atheist to say that it's improbable, for the atheist to say it's improbable for God to have morally sufficient reasons for allowing.
Okay, I'm still not hearing you. Would atheists say?
For the atheist to say that God probably doesn't have morally sufficient reasons for allowing some instance of suffering, wouldn't he have to be able to outline what a morally sufficient reason would look like?
Would I need to?
Would the atheist need to?
Oh, would he need to?
And
yeah, this is.
And if so, what kind of reasons have you heard from atheists about what they would accept as a morally sufficient reason?
Okay, this is a really good question, because this questioner has rightly discerned where the burden of proof lies. So often Christians mistakenly shoulder the burden of proof and think they've got to prove what God's morally sufficient reason is for permitting the evil and suffering in the world, whereas he points out it's the atheist who is making the claim that the evil and suffering in the world disproves the existence of God. It's the atheist who says it's improbable that God could have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil and suffering in the world. So it's the atheist who would need to show that there's no conceivable or no likely set of explanations as to why God permits the evil and suffering in the world. And I think you can see how enormously ambitious that is. How could he possibly survey the field of all the options that God might have for allowing this or that evil to occur? How could the atheist show that? Now, what might be, some of the reasons? Well, often atheists will talk about things like, could the evils in the world be permitted to bring about greater goods? Like you go to the dentist and experience pain because of the greater good of not having your teeth ache and fall out and rot. So that suffering is warranted. Or in the Allied landing on the beaches of Normandy, the commanders had to send soldiers at the Pointe du Hoc right into the teeth of those German machine gun nests, knowing that many of those soldiers would be just shot down before those machine guns could be taken out. But for the sake of the success of the invasion, they had to do it. They had to give those men up and allow them to be killed in order for the invasion to take place. And so atheists have said, well, there aren't any comparable reasons like that God could have for permitting the evil and suffering in the world. And I think that that's mistaken. I can think of good reasons why God might allow evil and suffering in many cases. And there isn't any one reason. I think there are multifarious reasons. And as I say, it may be so complex that we just have no inkling of why, for example, God allowed your daughter to die of leukemia or something like that. We may have no conception of the ripple effect that sends through history and why God allowed that. And the atheist would have to show that there can't be one, which nobody's in a position to say that. Yes?
Earlier when you were talking about the moral argument, you mentioned the definition of objective, and included in that you said that objective is mind independent. And then we as Christians, believing that God is an unembodied mind, then believe that all objective truth and objectivity is grounded in at least one unembodied mind. So do we need to make a distinction there between minds?
This gets to be a really tricky point. I think we all have an intuitive grasp of the difference between things that are mind dependent and things that are objective and actually exist without our minds. For example, a rainbow doesn't really exist out there. It's a visual perception that one has because of the way the water molecules reflect the light. A rainbow is not a mind-independent object. It's a mind-dependent object. Similarly, a mirage of water, when you see the water shimmering on the highway in the hot summer, that mirage is not an independently existing reality. It's mind-dependent, right? It's very different than an actual body of water that you could go jump in and swim. So I think we all have this kind of intuitive grasp of the difference between something that's just subjective, it's just in your mind, and something that's objective, that's independent of your mind. Now, the tricky part is that given theism, nothing is mind independent in another sense, in the sense that God is a mind and nothing exists independent of God because God creates everything. But I mean, in that sense, galaxies and planets are not mind independent entities. Nothing would be mind independent in that sense. So in that sense, the whole distinction would just collapse. And so it's obviously not that sense in which one is talking about mind dependence when one says that on naturalism moral values are just subjective. We mean more in the sense of illusions or mirages or something like that, not causally sustained by God, who is an ultimate mind. So I think it's very clear the sense in which one is using the word mind dependent as opposed to being causally dependent upon God, even though it isn't just a subjective reality.
Hey, I've been following your videos online for about 4 or 5 years, so I'm very excited to have the chance to speak with you today. And my question is concerning, earlier you made an allusion to the limitations of human cognition and epistemology and whether or not we are sufficiently justified to determine whether or not God is justified to permit a particular evil from happening. And my question is, why does God not, or why would God not reveal his reasons to mankind for permitting particular evils?
Well, I think there's a couple of ways to answer that. The question was, why doesn't God reveal the reasons for which he permits evil and suffering? Well, now, think about that for a minute. Would that even be possible? Think of the complexity. I mean, is God going to really kind of send a telepathic message to all the soldiers at D-Day telling them all of the reasons for the suffering and so forth that's going on? Some of the complexity would be so impossible that we couldn't even understand it. We couldn't grasp it if he were to do that. It would also turn the universe into a sort of haunted house where every time you stubbed your toe, you got this telepathic message from God, that this is why this is happening. I think that's just, it's crazy when you think about it. Moreover, here's another thing. It might be self-defeating if God did this. Suppose God told you, well, the reason I'm going to allow your daughter to be killed in an automobile accident, or the reason she was killed, is because I want to bring you and your wife closer together in your marriage through sharing this common grief, and therefore you'll be greatly used by me. And you might be so angry with God for doing that you would divorce your wife and thereby frustrate his purposes. Do you see what I mean? Some of these could lead to these sort of self-stultifying circles where then he wouldn't have the daughter die in the accident because it didn't bring about the good. So it's kind of like Scrooge in Dickens' Christmas Carol, when Scrooge says to the spirit of Christmas yet to come, are these the shadows of things that will be, or the shadows of things that may be only? And the spirit doesn't answer him. Silence. Why? Well, if the spirit had told Scrooge the truth, no, Scrooge, none of these things are really going to happen. Tiny Tim isn't going to die. We know that from the end of the story. Well, then maybe Scrooge wouldn't have repented, right? But then those things would have happened. So it would lead into this kind of self-stultifying situation. So what has God done instead? Well, this is the wisdom of the book of Job, I think. God doesn't tell Job why he's going through all this. He doesn't tell him the details. What he does show him is that you can trust me as you go through these things. Through the example of Jesus of Nazareth and his death on the cross, and the assurances that we have of divine providence and control over human history and life beyond the grave, God has given us sufficient assurances and grace to take us through the hard times without the answers. So I think that God has done what is sufficient to enable us to live with suffering without this very difficult problem of telling everybody every reason for which some instance of suffering comes into the world.
Would that make God a utilitarian or a type of utilitarian?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't think it does, because utilitarianism would say, look at the consequences of what you do, and then that will determine what's right or wrong. So if murdering this little girl would somehow bring about good consequences, then I am morally obligated to kill that little girl. And I'm not suggesting that with respect to God. Indeed, on my moral theory, I don't think God has any obligations to do anything, because moral obligations arise as a response to divine imperatives. Duties are the response to imperatives issued by a competent authority. And God doesn't issue commands to himself. So he doesn't have any duties to fulfill. What God does do is he always acts consistently with his good and holy and loving nature. So, to paraphrase Kant, God doesn't act from duty, but he does act in accord with duty simply by his own nature. And what that would mean is that God wouldn't allow that child molester or villain to kill and torture that little girl unless God had some sort of morally justifying reason for allowing that evil to be perpetrated. And what I've argued today is that, in fact, on the biblical view, God does have such reasons for allowing these atrocities to occur, and that someday that little girl in heaven will look back and say, I would go through it a million times over to know this joy and this happiness. So I don't think God's a utilitarian. Okay, how are we doing on time here? We've got about 5 more minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you. Dr. Craig, you frequently refer to God permitting evils and suffering in the world, but I'm wondering if, based upon how God set up the world and our privileged position in it, like Psalms 8 leaps to mind, for instance, if perhaps there are evils and suffering which he cannot have prevented.
Cannot what?
If perhaps there is evil and suffering that God could not prevent because of the way he set up the world and cannot lie.
Well, I mean, in one sense, God could prevent it just by not creating the universe, right? I mean, there's no evil that is absolutely unpreventable. But I think what you want to say, and what I affirmed earlier, is there may be certain worlds that are not feasible for God, given the way creatures would freely behave in certain situations. God may not be able to actualize a world in which they would behave differently because he gives them free will. So I think I'm wanting to agree with you, but just express it differently, not say they're unpreventable, but simply to say there are possible worlds that are not feasible for God.
It wasn't exactly what I was meaning. As an example, there's stories of things where God couldn't do something, like it says that Jesus went to a certain town where he was rejected and could do no mighty miracle there. And he frequently affirmed that certain miracles were performed because of their faith.
Yes, well, again, I mean, he gives the example of where it says that Jesus could do no miracle there because of their unbelief. I would see that as just a conditional situation where God has chosen not to do miracles except in response to faith. But I mean, in terms of his absolute power, of course he could do a miracle there. He could do anything he wants there. He's sovereign over the laws of nature. But in his economy, he has elected to give miracles in response to faith. And so in that conditional sense, Jesus could do no great work there because the people didn't meet the conditions, I think is the way I would put it. Yes?
I'd like to preface my question by saying I am not a solipsist. But with respect to the problem of suffering and the problem of religious pluralism, can we mitigate those by taking the problem of other minds seriously?
By taking what seriously?
The problem of other minds seriously. I've heard you say No one says that you're irrational because you believe in the existence of other minds. But is it possible that some of the people suffering, or some of the people who are in other religions, are philosophical pea zombies?
Are philosophical what?
Pea zombies. David Chalmers, zombies.
Oh, zombies. Oh, well, I don't think so. I don't think there are other human beings that lack minds. But let me draw an interesting application of this question that I think is very relevant to the problem of animal suffering. Michael Murray has written a very stimulating book called Nature Red in Tooth and Claw, in which he argues that apart from the great apes and human beings, animals are not aware that they are in pain when they experience pain. He says there are 3 levels of pain behavior in the animal world. First would be just reaction to stimuli. Poke an amoeba with a needle and it pulls back. But the amoeba doesn't sense any pain. It's just a stimulus and reaction. Second level would be pain. Sentient animals like horses and dogs and cats feel pain. They have nervous systems that have pain awareness. But the third level is a kind of higher order awareness that one is in the second order state. And he argues that animals, apart from the great apes and human beings, don't have the neural capacity for that third kind of self-awareness. I am myself in pain. So this is a tremendous help to the problem of natural evil and animal pain and suffering, because even though, say, a zebra, when a lion kills it and attacks it, is in pain, the zebra is not aware that it is itself in pain, which is remarkable when you think about it. So take a look at Murray's book, Nature Red in Tooth and Claw. I've written about this on the website, reasonablefaith.org, in a question of the week. Several weeks ago, there are 2 on animal pain and suffering, and these very interesting findings in neurology. So your hypothesis, I do think, is relevant to animal pain and to the problem of natural evil. Well, thank you very much for attending this session.